Hello everyone and welcome back to the YellowDog 3D Tips blog. Today we're going to be going over depth passes and velocity passes and how we use them to give depth of field and motion blur to our renders. Above you can see some examples of depth and velocity passes. We render them in this way so that we save render time. Depth of field usually takes a very long time to render out of a 3D program, as well as motion blur, so we export them as separate render elements. You can do this from pretty much any 3D renderer, but today we're going to be using V-Ray. So this is an example of a typical depth pass. What happens is it uses a gradient of black to white to represent things that are close or far away, white being the furthest away in this case, and black being the closest to the camera. There are a few different types of depth passes. This is a typical one of V-Ray, which uses white for far away. However, some renderers do use the opposite way around, so white for close-up, so be aware of this. And above is a velocity pass. Velocity passes use a mixture of red, green and blue values representing X, Y and Z movement. This tells the compositing software how things have moved and how fast they've moved, and this just allows us to create motion blur after we've rendered out from our 3D program. So in Nuke, here is our footage that we're going to be adding the motion blur and depth of field to. As you can see at the moment, it doesn't have any motion blur or depth of field on it. I've already gone ahead and set up the motion blur and depth of field in this particular comp. So as you can see, there is a nice blurred edge using the velocity pass, and we're getting that depth of field effect towards the back of the duck. So I'll just toggle these on quite fast just so that you can see the effect that this is having on the duck. So jumping over to Maya, we're going to set up our render settings. Remember, we are using V-Ray, so if you're using a different renderer, some of these steps might not translate. So opening up the render settings, we're going to change the image format to EXR. We use EXR because EXR allows us to store our separate passes within one image. So this is instead of rendering out our passes to separate files. It keeps everything nice and neat and easy to understand. So the next thing we need to do is go to our render elements tab within our V-Ray render settings, and we need to select Z depth and click add. So as you can see, it's added it to the render elements, and then we need to do the same for velocity. For the velocity pass, this requires pretty much no setup. It'll work straight out of the box in most cases. However, the Z depth does need a little bit of setup. So the main thing that needs setting up is this V-Ray depth white, and this is basically just telling V-Ray how far away you want to render the depth pass to. So you want to set this to the furthest away object in your scene. An easy way to find the correct value to put in this field is to go to Windows, Heads-Up Display and Object Details, and this will tell us the distance away from camera of any object that we click on. So in this case we've got this backdrop which is 11.161 units away from the camera. So if we put a value around this in our depth white field, it will give us a correct depth pass. It's always better to just use a slightly bigger value than you think, just so that we don't cut off our depth pass too early and lose information in the background. So all that's left to do is just render this out. In this case, I'm going to send it off to YellowDog to get a super fast render. So if I just click the little export button and set my frame range, so this particular clip ends at frame 132. So I'll just enter that and click export. And what this is going to do is it'll give you a compressed folder within your scenes directory. So once it's completed, you'll see a little box like this telling you where the file has been stored. So if we just jump over to our YellowDog account, we can just click new project, and this zip file can just be dropped onto here. Once it's finished uploading, we can just give it a name and click create. So once it's finished doing that, we do get a few settings. We're going to have to set the resolution manually, so I want to use 1080p, which is 1920 by 1080, and very important, in the format options we need to select EXR, and this is going to allow us to render with all of our passes intact. So I'll just turn the power up, get a quote and press start. So I'm just going to let this run. It's going to be using hundreds of different computers to render this scene for us, which is going to save us lots of time. So once you get your images back, you'll notice you get an image sequence of EXRs. We can drag them into Nuke, and in the channels box we can look through all the different channels. So here's our velocity pass and depth pass. So the first thing we need to do is add depth of field. We always add the depth of field before the velocity because you can get some unexpected results if you do it the other way around. So if we just drop a Z defocus node straight after our footage, you'll notice that you get this little focus point, and you can literally just drag that where you want the focus to be, and Nuke is going to recognize that there's a depth pass stored within the EXR, and it's going to automatically blur in the correct places according to our depth pass. So if you want to get a little bit more accurate, we can go to the node attributes and go to output and focal plane setup. Moving this depth of field slider is going to increase the region of focus. The green parts represent the focus, So in this particular example, I want the duck's face to be in focus and everything else to be slightly blurred. So if we go back to the result, we can see what effect that's had. So I want to increase the blur a little bit. So if we use this size slider, that's going to increase the amount of blur that we're going to see. So that's looking more like what I wanted to see. So as I mentioned earlier, there are different types of depth passes, and you can change the type of depth pass in the math drop down. In this case we're using far equals 0, which is correct for V-Ray. We can actually keyframe the focus plane as well by right clicking and click set key. We can use this to create like a focus pull or to keep the focus on one particular area. So we're now going to set up the motion blur by adding a vector blur effect, and we'll just add that directly after the defocus effect. I'll just let this load a little bit. I'll find a good area to demonstrate the motion blur. So this looks good. We'll be able to see a bit of motion blur on the edge of this cloth. So if we open up the node attributes for the vector blur, we'll see this parameter called UV channels. If we set that to velocity, which is our velocity pass, it's going to read the RGB values for the velocity and apply motion blur in the correct places. So I'm just going to temporarily disable the depth blur just so that this renders faster. If you did want to increase the amount of blur, you can change this multiply slider, and that's just going to change the scale of the blur. So if you wanted a blurrier shot, that's what you do. So I'm just going to scrub through to another position just to demonstrate what effect this is having. So as you can see on this bottom part of the cloth, when we disable and re-enable the node, you'll see the motion blur taking effect, which is exactly what we wanted, and I'm pretty happy with the amount of blur that we're getting. So I'm just going to re-enable the Z defocus node now, just to see what the effects look like in conjunction with each other. So as you can see, we're getting that nice soft edge from the depth of field, we're getting the motion blur working accurately, and it just creates this really nice effect, and it will just make your renders look that little bit more real. Once again, thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more YellowDog 3D tips. Cheers.